Hello, hello, hello. You're listening to Anchored and Devoted with Pastors Joseph and Pastor Jer. I'm Pastor Jer.
And I'm Pastor Joseph, and welcome back. We are so over the moon that you're here.
We really are. We hope that you have that you're enjoying this season 2 of Anchored and Devoted, and that you're benefiting from the conversations that we're having here. If you are, please, feel free to let us know. Drop us a line at anchoredanddevoted@gmail.com. You can send us some love. You can send us some hate, whatever you want. But we look forward to any correspondence from you, and we will certainly write back to you.
Amen.
Today, we're coming at you with a new topic, a new idea to camp out on, maybe for just one episode, maybe for a couple episodes, but to talk through some issues here of life and value from a Christian point of view. How should the Christian, especially the younger believer, think through the issues that we're sort of largely lumping under bioethics? But when it comes to bioethics, we're not just talking about the sanctity of life vis-a-vis abortion or euthanasia, but the sanctity of life as it comes to war, the sanctity of life as it comes to medical care, the sanctity of life as it comes to the progression of science. All of these topics weave in and out. And that's kind of our jumping off point for today. But Dave, why don't you give us some background on how this conversation came up between you and me? And then we can.
So today's our transparency day, it seems. We were talking about just things on our hearts as well as in our heads and things we've been wrestling with. And personally for me, I've been wrestling with how best to move forward with my health diagnosis and trying to balance trusting God, being fully informed with what's available, and also talking to the individuals in front of me. The diagnosis wasn't a positive one, and it was one that caused me to pause for a moment. But the pause wasn't out of fear; it was out of grief. In that moment, you're wrestling with, okay, how does this work? How does life work? How do you use time? And all those things are God things. And often we try and do them ourselves. And God made that real clear, like, you don't get in that world. There are things for you to engage with. And one of them is our topic today. How does it work when we talk about gene editing? So one of the treatments for multiple myeloma is going through chemo and then using some of the bone marrow before the treatment to send off to a lab where they spin it and do their thing and then give it back to you. And they edit out a lot of the stuff that you don't want and give it back to you so that hopefully you can bounce back. There isn't a cure for multiple myeloma, so it isn't a fix, but it is something that's come out in the last 2 to 3 years that there's a lot of hope around. As they've seen a number of individuals with significant positive responses. And some of the testing, is in the phase 3. So they've had a couple years of doing it, some even longer than that. It's easy when you're looking at the doctor and they tell you something to just go along with it because you're trusting them, even though their skin in the game is limited to a co-op or a co-payment.
Right.
Co-op as far as it's the time that we spend together and we're working together in the same task. But the collaboration is also based on a transaction. The treatment options are a variety, but that's one. And I wanted to wrestle a little bit with it today because the ramifications of gene editing impact not just me personally, knowing that, not planning on having any more kids, so there's no issue as far as this being passed on to anyone. But even when it comes to the things that a number of the companies like CRISPR and Editas and Gene are doing, there's the potential for it to be passed on. And then there is the reality that many of them are working on stuff that shouldn't be passed on past the individual. As we were wrestling with this in conversation, one of my big concerns is not solely for the companies that are working on this, but the companies that we don't know of in countries that we work with that are doing their own thing, and just how you could end up with a healthcare system, countries where people, governments, agencies are working to push agendas that impact your health and the health of others without the conversation being had on, is this okay? I remember when it first came out that the gene editing was taking place, there was a Nobel Peace Prize given to some of those that came up with the CRISPR system and began, I want to say with mRNA as well. It's a lot. I mean, it's just a lot personally.
It is a lot, and it brings up a number of different questions. You asked one of them: is this a good thing? You also implied several questions: to what extent is this helpful, and how do we measure what is helpful? How do we discuss what is helpful in terms of the impact on the individual who is ill, the impact to the family, the impact to society, the impact to future generations? And then you also have, is this safe? And that safety question has to be asked not just in terms of the individual and their health, specifically when we're talking about health issues, but it also has to be, we also have to discuss safety in terms of how could this technology be used as a weapon by anybody? How could it be used both as a positive force in humanity and as a negative force? And that led to a secondary topic as we were talking. And that was, I think you said it was one news outlet that you saw when the US first stated that they had an unmanned drone, an automated drone, firing in combat circumstances.
Right.
Oh, now, Dave, you were at the Naval Academy 20 years ago.
Yeah,
and even back at, it's been a minute, man. Even at that point, we already were employing technology that we could set on basically prowl or... It was called loiter mode.
Loiter mode,
thank you. That's what I'm looking for.
Not in top secret there. It's just pretty much almost like parking a system. So it stays put in a fixed area until you need to move upon a target. But that was still one that only engaged as far as waiting for certain things to take place. So if anyone out there is a coder, you understand the process coding wise, where the machine in front of you knows it just stays in that position, even though it is in action, it's circling or whatever up in the clouds. Once it sees a certain vehicle, individuals are notified, that kind of stuff. But last year, 2021, I remember hearing, I only heard it on PBS, of the first individuals that were being killed by robots that were manned with AI. And that made me cry, honestly. It wasn't, when I went to the academy, it wasn't because of it wasn't solely for the loss of life. I was disheartened by that. And I was also disheartened with the understanding, not of the Terminator or anything like that, but just where does life find value when we allow for something that we've created, like artificial intelligence, to take it. That to me is just wow. Right. That's, war has always been so in your face. And we continue to distance it and try and make it sanitary so that it's acceptable to us. And I say us, the Western world, because the rockets aren't landing on our house or in our streets or wherever. It's one of those things. It's one of those things where my heart aches when someone can create code that allows for a machine to understand this is the actions that I need to take place, and it takes life.
And that's the tie-in here between these two topics for me is there's code that once written does what it is going to do. And the safety of that code is no longer supervised the way that things are supervised when I still have to push a button or make a switch or punch in new code to update actions, whether we're talking about gene editing or whether we're talking about programming AI. The safety question here for me is how do I, as a Christian, view a set of instructions that are, to some extent, and maybe I'm being pejorative here, maybe I'm going too far with this, but to some extent, the instructions that are coded in here are fire and forget. Once it's written and you release it, there's not well, let's just pull that back and fix this. We realized down the road there's a problem, or realized down the road this isn't having the effect we wanted, or it's causing different problems, or someone has hijacked this for their own purposes. Once it's released, we no longer have control over. We can no longer put it back into its proper place. And so it becomes the issue of bioethics is one that, as I look at it, it's also a question of boundaries. How do we determine as Christians what are the proper boundaries and what are the areas of self-governance that we are giving up, and when we do that, how aware are we? What is the thought process that goes into our decision when we give up these areas of self-governance? Because again, once I introduce something into my body that I have no control over, I'm giving up self-governance. Once there is AI that is acting against or for my life without my impacting it, I've given up self-governance. Am I thinking through these things, and how am I responding as a Christian? What is my posture? What's my perspective? And what am I going to do about it moving forward?
For me personally, I've been wrestling with, Genesis, God made us in his image, looking at chapter 1 and wrestling with that. And then looking also at the first loss of life and how much it grieves God to see his creation destroying each other. And so when I think about CRISPR, and CRISPR is the editing system, I guess. Yes, there's a company called CRISPR, but that's because they use that process to edit genes and try and help people. The tough part of this conversation is, where is your relationship with God? And are you listening to him with a goal of him first, not my comfort first? So for those individuals who are in pain and struggling and, are thinking of potential ways to end the season early because medicine allows that in other countries, for me personally, that isn't something I believe we should be focused on right now. We should be focused on glorifying God, knowing that every day is an opportunity to do that. And the quality of life should be determined by him, not by me. We can get into another time, Jared, if we want to talk about, what's in the will and all that kind of stuff as far as,
Sure.
An accident and whether they keep me on life support and all this stuff. But that's not it. Right now I'm just talking about just the medicine of, and the opportunities and just how there has to be time to pray and talk to God about what is he doing? Mm-hmm. What does he want you to use this time for? How everyone wants to go to heaven, but no one wants to die. And the fear often causes us to reach for things that are not for us. And so a doctor's desire is to extend the life as long as possible. Whereas for many individuals, God has granted them peace to know that this is the end and we shouldn't fight them. We should ask them, what has God been putting on their heart? As opposed to praying for the miracle. If God's made it clear, no, it's time for you to come home, enjoy the season, then enjoy the season with them and don't fight them. On the flip side, if this is a spiritual warfare thing and God's made it clear, no, keep coming to me, keep asking, this is part of your journey, this is part of your story, then do just that. And know that as you engage with medicine, God is the one in charge. He's the one who will guide you to meet those individuals that are proper. Okay, that was my little personal commercial break for those going through things before we jump into the editing. I personally feel like the church is missing the mark, just to get back into our normal groove. This is a conversation that I think we need to look at the text and wrestle with the knowledge that God is the one who gives us purpose as instruments of his, as him being the one who molds the clay, and we are those broken pots he decides to use. We have to be humble. I do think when we talk about being made in his image, that's huge when it comes to how precious it is. So when it comes to people having access to good health care, I think that should be, and we assume that because of where we live and where we are, but I think that should be understood that this is a way to love your neighbor, to love the other. I struggle with the opportunity to extend days and still, be good. But knowing that same tool could be used to harm others. It could be used in the future to harm others.
Intentionally or unintentionally.
Correct. We were wrestling with this the other day. The fact that, you could go to the hospital and your children and my children could have grandkids, or we could have grandkids, or they could have children that have edited out all the issues that plague you and I, which sounds like a miracle.
Yeah, sounds like paradise. Get rid of all pain, get rid of all.
Correct.
I could make some racist jokes right there.
Oh, no, please stop.
I did, but I'm saying it because of this. The fact that I could make racist jokes about quality of life improvements based on gene editing is because of the way that this could be used.
Oh, and that's part of...
in completely sinful ways.
That's part of my concern is what then becomes the line of where do you stop? Is it one of those things where I want my son to be the best swimmer? And so now it's a couple tweaks and a couple extra $100 and he's already got the genes for being big. That's not an issue. We help him out a little bit and make sure that his lung capacity is a little more increased and some other stuff, just natural stuff, just bigger lungs, a little bit, some other things that would help him.
A few mods, few upgrades.
Yeah, again, nothing crazy. Mm-hmm. Is that something I have to disclose when I get married? That all of our kids are going to be genetically different? Is that part of the conversation we as pastors have with those getting married? like we ask, is there any relationship by kin? But do we go into that? Do we really wrestle with the impact on those who can't afford these upgrades and yet need medical services that I'm not even considering? Like I'm not helping pay off their debt or helping them get to a level of health care that will allow for them to glorify God in their best life.
Yes. These are real issues. We can pull this out of the context of gene editing and put it simply into the context of how do we make moral decisions? What's the framework or the paradigm that we use to make decisions of moral impact and moral consequence when we're talking about providing services or resources that are by definition limited in number to a population that is by definition greater than that number of resources. We had in 2021 the first interspecies transplantation of a pig heart into a human. And at this point in history, it is going well, at least as of the date that we're recording this. But the question has come up. That's correct. But the question's come up. Should this person have even received this transplantation because this person had a criminal history that includes things that make him look like a very unsavory person? Mm. That's its own question. And I've heard answers from the medical community. The answer from the medical community is we are here to provide medical services regardless of the moral impact. It doesn't matter who you are. Once you're on my operating table, I am on your side. It's the same as if I'm a lawyer. It doesn't matter what you did. My job is to fight as hard as I can for you within the law. That's an answer. And I think that's a pretty solid basis for the medical community. But this doesn't simply impact the medical community. Coming through COVID, we can be real here. It doesn't matter what you think. The medical community is one perspective, and it's one that has to be balanced within the greater societal requirements wherever you are. Medical side has one set of perspectives. Scientific's going to have one set of perspectives. Economics going to have one perspective. The church should have its own. And the question is, how do we talk about what ours is and what the underlying and driving principles are? Because as I think through this, and I told you this earlier, beyond the image of God that's imprinted on man as being a fundamental starting point for having this discussion. One of the filters that I look at this through is what Isaiah is alluding to when he talks about, and he criticizes the nation of Israel. He says, you, at the same time, you cut down a tree, you cut it in half, you take half of it, you carve it into an idol. You take the other half, you make a fire and cook your food, and then you offer that food to the first half of the log that you made into an idol as an oblation for something, as a way to appease gods. And it's ridiculous. But what's implied in that, what I think is really important for us to grasp, is that we are going to make gods for ourselves. Or rather, I should say, we're going to identify the God that we will serve. And once we have identified that God, we will be bound to obey and serve him. Which is why, for me as a Christian, it doesn't matter. It's not important that you are not a Christian. What's important to me, even beyond the fact that you're not a Christian, is that you are serving somebody. And because I care about you, I want you to be serving the person who cares about you. And from what I've seen, that's only the God of the Bible. Now, I could be wrong. And I'm open to being argued with. I'm open to looking at this. But as I have honestly looked at it for the course of my life, I've come back to this answer over and over again. The way that you can best be served is to be in obedience to God. Everything else is going to make a slave out of you and then eat you up as its food. And these technologies fall into that same paradigm of thinking. Yes, they provide a means of military superiority, military and national security. They provide a source of medical breakthrough and medical extension of health and treatment. However, they also demand an obedience to the parameters that we have agreed they exist in. And that's where we have to pause. That's where we have to really be careful and say, because of the second paradigm of once I have identified my God, I must obey that God. That then comes into question, or that forces us to look at the question, how then do we look at the value of man, the value of humanity in light of this God's paradigm? Because as a Christian, the image of God in man, the imago Dei, is one of the most necessary foundational principles. I would say at least second to the incarnation of the God-man, the Christ, and his work. I think second to that, possibly parallel with that in terms of the foundation of what we believe, is the imago Dei. That God made us in his image. He made us to be like him. He granted to us value out of himself. And he made us to desire the good things that are from him. So our desire for security, our desire for health, our desire for prosperity, our desire for truth and for justice, all come from the image that he granted to us when he made us like himself. It's easy to neglect that image and to assume that these things are innately of us, that they are not from God, and then to find things that seem to satisfy these desires and mistake those things as the God that will fulfill this desire, but then we become enslaved too. And that's where I think we really have to be careful.
Yeah, taking it out of, a good Christianese that you and I understand. Our desire to live now and stay here, we must be mindful, shouldn't be in front of what God wants to do. That's right. My big concern is that often we're making the decision based off of what we feel should take place as opposed to what God is doing. Right. Example, quality of life, looking at seniors, well, they've slowed down, they've passed the prime, whatever reason you want to rationalize. I can go the other way and say they bear the image of God. They have the opportunity to share the gospel wherever they are. If they can't share verbally anymore, they have the ability to share through touch. If they can't share through touch, God still has a space in place for them so that you can show grace and mercy, so that you can grow. Right. It's not simply about my convenience or comfort. And I know that's hard, but I really believe there's a reason why God didn't give in the Garden of Eden much of the stuff we have today. After they were kicked out, he didn't say, okay, and here is XYZ to continue doing these things. Yes, they lived a ridiculously long life. We can go to Genesis and have some fun with that. But I really think there's a reason why God wants us to go to him, bringing what's been presented, having multiple conversations with doctors or lawyers or, whatever, so that you have the best information. I'm not saying don't do that, but take it to God to see, okay, God, what are you doing? Right. What are you doing? Is it time for me to fight for forever? Or when is it, you let me know and I'll continue to check in with you to make sure I know when is it time to stop this. Right? I often have individuals who come and say, hey, I was diagnosed with stage 4, blah, blah, blah. They've given me 6 months and I'm jumping into treatment for the next 6 months. And it's like, okay, what did God say? Like, where is God in the midst?
Yes.
I hear the doctor. I know that this is standard, procedure for treatment at this time. I get it. What is God saying? Like, have you had any other conversations with anyone else? Have we prayed about this? Not that you're going to not continue with the treatment, but there could be a question of, okay, God knows your days. If you've only got 3 months left and he has things for you to do, reaching out to others, sharing stuff before you transition so that they hear the truth from you, as opposed to fighting for life that isn't yours, because your life is found in Christ. And I know that that's hard because we view it as our own when we are his.
Well, again, we've said this a number of times, both in Daily Gains and last season in Anchored and Devoted. We have an idea that life should get easier and more comfortable. And the answer to that I would give is yes, it should, but it's not going to in this life. In this life, we've been promised one thing. In this life, you will have tribulation. We're going to have tribulation from the moment that we draw our first breath to the moment that we give up our last breath. And as we walk through that tribulation, the question that we have to ask every single day is, who am I going to trust? Some trust in horses and some trust in chariots. I will trust in the name of the Lord my God. And that doesn't mean I'm not going to pursue this avenue or that avenue. It doesn't mean it's predetermined. It means that when it comes to these questions, I start by saying, my God holds my days. My God holds my future. I'm going to go to him and have this conversation before I assume I know what the answer is. And that's, I think, what you're saying, and that's a challenge. And I'm trying to land the plane here because we've only just scratched the surface, and we're about 35 minutes in.
I know you're trying to land, but I will say that for those that are in positions of power, and this was my pushback even against you yesterday when we were talking about this some, Jaron, even before this time, was we need people who are having this conversation with God in those positions when we're talking about taking life or aiding life. Like, right. Okay, where is the spiritual connection? It doesn't mean that there needs to be a prayer time before every, missile is shot. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying someone should be talking to God and being able to hear, like, what is your will, not just ours. We see it in the now, like this appears to be a threat, but you see throughout all of time, what could you have us do? And know that sometimes that requires us to wait. Sometimes that requires us to see opportunities in different ways and also embrace things that we might not even be comfortable with. And that might mean, again, being patient. As you state, let's land this a little bit. Where are things when it comes to gene editing for me? It's one of those things where I'm very much open to it. Again, I've had my conversation with God, so I know where we are. But I also know, more importantly, that I'm to glorify him and talk to the doctors and talk to the nurses and share my faith. And I also know that I'm to engage with the community around me and write and read and speak and use the time appropriately. Because it isn't a cure. And the fun part is it's not a cure for anyone. Like, just like in the book of Genesis, everyone's going to die. So we need to be about doing the work that God has called us to do. Well,
we've certainly laid out a number of questions for people to be wrestling with. And I, just so that you, the listener, know where Dave and I are, besides getting the feedback here from the government about the things we're talking about, as we're talking about this stuff. We have not closed this discussion up. We're wrapping this up for this morning. But we're going to come back to this and continue this conversation because it is one that like I said, we've only scratched the surface. We've asked a number of questions. We do want to now do exactly what we said and look back to God to hear his voice on these. But for that, you're going to have to tune back in. So tell your friends, grab some popcorn, and listen back in to the next episode.
Have a blessed day.